Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, founder and president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, the foundation that brings you the principled, uncompromising case for libertarianism. And this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled case for the various issues of the world from a libertarian perspective. And I'm joined as I am every week by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel and who is a principled libertarian himself. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you and our viewers and listeners.
All right, Richard, we've had two more mass shootings in America, one in El Paso and one in Dayton. And same sort of syndrome that is now afflicting American life. It's become the new normal, where these people who are obviously off-kilter mentally take a high-powered weapon or rifle or pistol and just start shooting people that they don't even know. And sometimes without any kind of apparent motive, other times what looks to be a motive that's kind of a weird motive. And then we hear the standard calls for gun control, that all of this is happening because there's just too many guns in America, and that don't worry, that we enact more strict gun control laws, everything will be taken care of. Well, when the same thing happened in California recently, the same arguments were made, but California has some of the strictest gun control laws in the country. I mean, here was the shooter going into a garlic festival with a high-powered weapon. It was illegal to do that, and under California's strict gun control laws, and yet here's the guy breaking the law. And it's what I've said from the very beginning. I mean, when we started FFF some 30 years ago, that if somebody doesn't give a hoot about a murder law, he's darn sure not going to give a hoot about a gun control law. And that all that you end up doing is disarming peaceful and law-abiding people, preventing them from defending themselves against these people. So now, of course, there's always this dream, this fantasy, that you can get rid of every gun in America, like in China or Cuba or North Korea, which is ridiculous because there are so many guns in American society that there's no way you could get rid of the guns. And then you've got guns internationally, so all you would end up doing is producing a massive black market. I mean, if you like the black market in drugs and the violence that is produced, you'll love the war on guns and the illegality of guns. And the only people who would be end up getting the guns are the people who are going to be getting them on the black market, the murderers and the rapists and the robbers and so forth. Now, the El Paso situation seems a little bit interesting because apparently they're linking it so far, we don't know all the details, to some anti-immigrant manifesto. Well, you know, this is what both conservatives and Democrats had brought on for the last umpteen years, of calling illegal immigrants invaders. They're invading the United States. Well, it's not an invasion. An invasion is what the U.S. empire did to Iraq. Bombs and missiles, death, destruction. Immigrants are peacefully crossing borders in search of a better life. That's not an invasion. But in the mind of the person who's a little bit off kilter, he sees that, oh my God, I'm going out and defending America. He's going to get up in front of the judge in his little off kilter way and say, Your Honor, I'm a patriot. I was protecting America from these invaders. But again, the root is the immigration controls themselves. If you didn't have these controls, you wouldn't have all this talk of invaders and invasion and all this other nonsense. And we don't know what the guy in Dayton's motivation is. It seems to be one of those just random killings again. And you know, I've put forth a thesis at FFF, Richard, and I can't prove it. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I can't help but believe that these forever wars, where the U.S. empire has been killing people overseas for 30 continuous years, does not ultimately have an adverse impact on American society. I mean, even though the media protects us from the death and destruction that's wreaking over there, I mean, the U.S. empire has killed probably well over 1 million people in the last 30 years in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. And you know, the attitude has been is as long as Americans are cocooned, that they're protected from all this death and destruction, and they go about their lives with vacations and work and sports events and concerts, that everything will be fine, that you have these two separate worlds of death and destruction and then so-called normality here at home. I don't think that's possible. I think ultimately all this death and destruction, this Death Star that kills people with mayhem and bombs and missiles and assassinations, it's been going on for 30 years. It's ultimately going to seep into the subconscious of the American people. And my thesis is that might be what's triggering some of these off-kilter people to go out and do the same type of mayhem and death and destruction against people they don't know that really the U.S. empire has been doing overseas. They're mirroring the conduct, and in their little, off-kilter minds, they don't draw a distinction between American life and foreign life. For example, the U.S. government essentially says foreign life is valueless. American life is very valuable. Well, in the mind of the off-kilter guy, he just sees it as, hey, no life has value. American life, foreign life, what the heck? And he goes out and starts creating this massive mayhem. I can't prove the thesis, but I tell you this. There is no logical way that a government can be engaged in constant killing without it somehow adversely affecting the populace over time. So that's my take on these things. If people want to bring an end to this, I say bring all the troops home, end the war on immigrants, end the war on drugs, end all the violence and destruction of liberty in our society, and then let's see where we are. My prediction is you would have a society that would tend toward liberty, peace, prosperity, and harmony, and a lack of violence is manifested in these out-of-control killings. What do you think?
Well, let me sort of elaborate one thing you said. You pointed out that the shooter in El Paso had left this manifesto, this 12-page or 4-page manifesto, and saying in which he hated immigrants and he was a self-declared white supremacist or whatever. But the Washington Times yesterday, at least the article that I read online last night, did have an identification in terms of motivation of the shooter in Ohio, in Dayton. He was a self-proclaimed socialist. Yeah. He said that he abhorred Donald Trump. He wanted the death of the Joe Biden generation in the Democratic Party and could not wait to vote for Elizabeth Warren. That was part of this man's motivation, at least according to the article in the Washington Times as placed online last night, and I assume one could still find it today. So now, what is motivating these people?
Wait a minute. Let me ask you a question about that. So what was the logic behind his shooting? What was he trying to accomplish there with that mindset?
That is ambiguous, because he also, according to social media searches about him, they did identify him. That is, the media through the police identified him. He said he was for control. Guns kill. My sort of working hypothesis, if the information about him is true, as I just related it, just as example, the fellow in New Zealand who those churches in Christchurch, in his manifesto, was hoping to instigate a race war between whites and blacks, because he considered, the black-white civilization being threatened. If this information is true and you're trying to do a little bit of psychobabble, I could easily imagine that this fellow, who was a self-proclaimed socialist, a pro-Elizabeth Warren person, et cetera, could be thinking by an act of violence of this type, he would generate a raised consciousness on the evils of uncontrolled guns and the need for a socialist shift in America. Now, that is my very rough interpretation from the little scanty information, but motivation in his case. But more broadly, Jacob, let me suggest this. What is in the mind of all of these shooters whether it be the Islamic terrorists who have committed these acts sometimes in the United States, or what appears to be this white nationalist in El Paso, or let us suppose this socialist in Ohio, if that is true as well, or the fellow in New Zealand earlier this year. Think of how they're thinking about people. It is a philosophy of collectivism. You're white or you're black. You're pro-establishment, capitalist exploitation, or you're for the oppressed, the marginalized, and the exploited workers. Okay? So human life is reduced to these collectivist and tribalist categories. And as a result, you no longer see people as people with their individual qualities and characteristics, their individual rights. They're just part of a collective, a tribe, a group. And therefore, through this collectivist identification, you're seeing something, and they're the enemy, or they're the opposition, or they're the threat. They're the ones we have to fight to save, quote, us. And it is this collectivist mentality which seems to run through all of this. Again, whether it be the Muslim fanatic who undertakes his acts of violent terrorism, either abroad or in the United States in these instances, right? It's the true Muslim faith as he interprets the Quran versus the infidels, or preserving the white race versus the racial barriers or threats, or standing up for the workers as opposed to the enemy capitalists. All of this is a tribalist and a collectivist mentality that loses the identity, significance, and sacredness of the individual. Now compare this collectivist psychology and mentality. If, as you were suggesting, in a sense I'm paralleling what you were also saying, I suppose, that people thought of each other in the context of the ideas and ideals of the Declaration of Independence and the underlying political philosophy in the Constitution, particularly the Bill of Rights, and that is individuals have rights. That by accident of birth, you have certain parents, you may have a certain skin pigmentation, your ancestors may have come from a particular part of the world, but that's all background to what is in the foreground. And what's in the foreground is you as a distinct and unique and special individual who should be recognized to have his inalienable rights to his life, his liberty, his honestly acquired property, and his peaceful pursuit of happiness. Once you reduce people to individuals rather than these tribal and collectivist categories, then on what basis are you shooting people? Now, there's been murders on individualistic basis. I hate Joe because he's been sleeping with my wife. That's a different situation. But these mass murders clearly are guided by a psychology and a mentality of collectivism and tribalism. And as long as that's permeated the society, and it pervades all of our society, it's not thus the war mentality as you were bringing out, but everything in the media, everything in the educational establishment today. It's gender, it's race, it's social class. As long as the psychology and the sociology, and therefore the politics and economics of collectivism, tribalism dominate our society, then we should not be too surprised, in my humble opinion, we should not be too surprised when individuals who are surely off balance proceed to take weapons and aim them at those that they depersonalize and reduce to these collectivist categories.
I couldn't agree with you more, and you express it in a different way, but this is the point I'm making with respect to the U.S. government, our government in actions overseas. I mean, today people in the federal government, many in Congress, are saying that the invasion of Iraq was a mistake. Clearly it turned out to be a mistake. Well, what do they mean by that? Well, they mean that it's turned out to be a fiasco. It didn't accomplish very much. It shouldn't have been done. Well, no, very few of them have ever come to grips with what really happened here. I mean, this was a regime, the U.S. government, that invaded a country that had never attacked the United States. The U.S. was the aggressor here, and they said, oh well, we're looking for WMDs. Well, They never had the authority to look for WMDs. That was a UN operation, a UN resolution. If anybody wanted to enforce UN resolutions, it had to be the United Nations. No individual nation can enforce UN resolutions. So they invade this country. Oh, we're looking for WMDs. Oh, we didn't find them. It was an honest mistake. Nobody ever comes to grips with the idea that it may not have been an honest mistake. It may have been a ruse to invade the country and accomplish what the sanctions had failed to accomplish. 11 years of sanctions that had killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqi people. They had failed to achieve regime change. So they used the 9/11 attacks and the WMD scare to get in there, because as soon as they realized that there was no WMDs, which, by the way, Saddam Hussein had gotten from the United States and other Western countries to wage war against Iran, they didn't leave the country. They didn't say we're sorry for this mistake. Instead, they stayed occupying the country. Now, how many Iraqis did they kill? We don't know, because they didn't care how many they killed. When Madeleine Albright in '96 was asked, is the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children from the sanctions worth it? And she thought for a moment and said, well, it's a tough issue, but yeah, it's worth it. Now, how much value are they placing on human life? Now, over here, you got ministers all across America talking about the sanctity of human life of the unborn. And they stress that and they emphasize it. But never once do they mention the value of lives of people in Iraq or value of people in Afghanistan. You have had wedding parties bombed. Are there any stories of the aftermath, the flower girls that were killed, the bride that was killed, the parents, the grief, the suffering? No, we never hear about it. We're protected. We're immunized from all this. But one thing is clear. They place no value on the lives of these foreigners whatsoever. And yet, from a Christian perspective, the life of every person is sacred. Now, Americans have been inculcated with this notion of, oh, the troops are over there protecting our freedom, Jacob. They're protecting our freedom. It's just a lie. Nobody over there is trying to take away our freedom. Nobody's ever tried to take away our freedom. At worst, they retaliate with terrorism because of what the death and the mayhem are producing over there in the Middle East and Afghanistan. That's what the attack on the World Trade Center in '93 was about, the USS Cole attack, the attacks on the embassies in East Africa, the 9/11 attacks. It's retaliation. So you have this total lack of value that's placed on the lives of human beings overseas. That is no different from the mindset of these killers over here. That for some reason, something's getting triggered within them to say, I can just go out and create the same kind of mayhem here. No value at all for the individual, the sanctity of the individual. They don't even know these people. And they're just over there creating this death and destruction, which is no different from the mindset of the U.S. government in the Middle East and Afghanistan. And this is why I've continued to argue. You and I talked about this. I don't know if you recall this many, many years ago, that when a country's constantly at war, it's going to have an effect on civil society at home. People become less civil to each other. Their tempers are short. That ultimately it just seeps into the fiber. All this death and destruction seeps into the fiber of civil society and has an adverse effect on that. I think that the lack of value that is placed on the lives of foreigners is seeping into the subconscious of these people who are off kilter mentally, and who ordinarily, given a normal functional society, would just live their lives a little weird. But instead, something's getting triggered there that's causing them to do this mayhem. I say, let's stop these forever wars. Let's bring all the troops home, and then let's see what happens. Since it's the right thing to do anyway, we got nothing to lose.
Well, if I can sort of pick on that thing for a moment, back at the beginning of the 20th century, the famous classical liberal sociologist William Graham Sumner wrote an essay following the Spanish-American War, of course, which was short, but which we won in defeating Spain. He wrote an essay called "The Conquest of the United States by Spain." And what he meant by that is that Spain had conquered the United States because of the mentality of the Spanish imperialist. Conquering territory, ruling over others without their consent, a large military establishment, the idea that the nation takes precedent and its importance and place in the society over the individual, either your own citizen or those who live in other countries. Also, back in about 1957, a classical liberal journalist and author named Felix Morley, not well remembered today, but he was prominent in, quote, right of center circles back in the mid-decades, wrote an article in American Age called American Republic or American Empire. And there he said, too, once you have this pursuit of empire, it changes the structure of the government, what it spends on, how it spends it, the attitude of what it's for. So all of these show that you cannot really separate a direction that the government follows and its impact on people's psychologies and attitudes and behavior. You know, it's well known, people, that when people have been mustered out of the military after violent wars, sometimes it would be said about the Civil War, certainly in Germany after the First World War, that people have been in the trenches or been fighting for years. They know nothing other than war, life and death, the uncertainty as to whether you will lose your own life tomorrow, a tribalist camaraderie of depending upon others in your unit, and it's either them versus us. And then when war is over, this has created immense mental and psychological problems for the veterans who have returned, either as victors or as the defeated. And part of what you are bringing out is variations on that theme, I would suggest. And if I can just bring out one other point, piggybacking on an earlier remark of yours as well. Madeleine Albright. Now, it's famous that the media picked up on this idea that, is it worth the death of hundreds of thousands of children through these sanctions of food, medical supplies, etc., to try to defeat Saddam Hussein and his threat? And she said yes. Now the perversity of this is Madeleine Albright was Jewish. She lived through the Holocaust. She and her family experienced what it meant to be reduced to a collective identity separate from your individual sense of being a human being, and how by doing so, the person who's doing the categorizing may decide that you are less than human and to be obliterated by any violent means to purify a society from such tribal vermin. For her to have lived through that and experienced it personally, and then herself have a mentality of, well, what does it matter? They're just Iraqi children. So there's the higher good of bringing about regime change or transformation or policy in Iraq. Well, what was in the mind of the Nazis? It's for the higher good of the German people to eradicate an inferior people. So she herself became a captive of the very mentality that destroyed her own family.
Yeah, and you see that same mindset with respect to sanctions and embargoes against various countries. I mean, look at what the U.S. government's doing to the people of Iran, people of North Korea, people in Cuba for 50-something years. They are targeting innocent people. I mean, people they don't even know, with death and destruction, economic impoverishment. I mean, there's people that have died in Iran from plane crashes because the commercial airline industry domestically can't get the parts to keep the planes maintained because of the U.S. sanctions against them. And the idea is we will kill or squeeze economically the Iranian people to such an extent that either the government will abdicate, or their government will do as we tell them to do, or there'll be a violent revolution or a coup where thousands of people might die. And there's no upward limit on the number of people that can die. I mean, look at what Hillary Clinton said when they incited this revolution in Libya, this regime change operation, that she just gloats when she sees Gaddafi getting murdered and says, oh, we came, we saw, and we killed him, or something like that, without any regard to the number of people that would be dying and that were dying in this now civil war for who's going to control the country. And keep in mind that and the same thing's happening in North Korea, where they target the North Korean people don't even know, with mass starvation in the hopes that they will rise up against the regime. And if they rise up, they don't have guns because of the gun control crowd in that country, and there are going to be massive death occurring to take on the government, which is very well armed. U.S. officials don't care about that. Doesn't matter how many people have to die if they are able to get their concept of regime change. And keep in mind that Albright, when she made that statement of callous indifference to the deaths of these Iraqi children from U.S. sanctions, was working as U.S. ambassador to the UN under the Bill Clinton regime. These are the Democrats, the ones that tell us they love the poor, needy, and disadvantaged. Not one single U.S. official from Clinton on down, as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, but not one of them condemned her, criticized her, made her apologize, made her retract. Why? Because they undoubtedly agreed with her sentiment that the deaths of these 500,000 Iraqi children from U.S. sanctions was in fact worth it, worth the effort to get regime change. Well, how is that indifference to the death and destruction that they are intentionally targeting innocent people with different from these guys over here who are taking a high-powered weapon and shooting people they don't even know, that they don't have any real beef against? They're kind of using it as an example to achieve their end. I mean, like you bring up this guy in Dayton, which if what you say the news media is saying is true, where is the logic of that? That he's going to go out and kill a bunch of random people in order to affect a gun control agenda? I mean, how is that different from using sanctions against innocent people to affect regime change? To me, it's the same mindset, the lack of a concern for the sanctity of human life.
Yeah, let me sort of just now sort of come back to where we started. And that is, obviously, these are terrible tragedies, obviously for the victims, but surely for the friends, the family members, the relatives, all of whom have to live with the aftermath of these mass shootings. And the knowledge that, that if someone had not gone shopping or if someone had been someplace else, they would not have been a victim, or their loved one would not have been a victim. And it's very easy to raise that emotive despair and anger and sense of injustice to the foreground. But I think we also always need to take the long-run view. And that is, even in the best of societies, there are going to be nuts and crazy people. Some will strangle a human being that they have some grudge against to death. Others will kill some woman after they brutally raped her because of a concern of identification. Some will pull out a knife and use a knife to rob another person. So the fact is, there's always going to be these crazy people, any means of taking another human life. But in this context, Jacob, it seems to me that we have to remember that even with this, we need to take the long view, and the wisdom and the importance of the ideas captured in that Second Amendment, that the citizenry should have the right to self-protect themselves. If there are aggressors, private individuals, who invade their homes and their lives on the street, threaten the lives and well-being of their loved ones, that an individual has a right of means of self-defense, including of lethal force in an extreme situation, to ward off an attacker. And at the same time, it was clear in the minds of the Founding Fathers that the ultimate threat to people's liberty and life and property can be, and historically has been, the government itself. No matter how many people may have died in El Paso or in Ohio or these other instances, they pale into insignificance if one is stepping back and thinking of it just in terms of numbers. They pale in insignificance to the mass murder of tens of millions by governments around the world. And that means that individuals must have some means in extreme situations when their own society can become a tyranny. Because one never knows what a government could do in the future, regardless of its policies and actions of the past. That as a final recourse, an individual has the means of defending himself against his own tyrannizing government. And that cannot be lost. You sort of have to step back and show dispassionate logic, dispassionate perspective on the underlying principles and the necessary institutions of a preserved free society against both private and government aggression, to see the importance of the right to bear arms for the society as a whole. A few years ago, there were mass stabbings of people in China. As you say, there was gun controls in China, but there's an ethnic minority in Western China, the Uyghurs, who are extremely oppressed by the Chinese government. There's over 1 million of them in, quote, re-education camps right now to indoctrinate them out of their Muslim faith and to be strong, obedient soldiers in the ideology of the Chinese society. Some, in their own mad frustration, felt that they had to strike out. And in several places in China, they went and with knives proceeded to just kill people and badly wound people in several cities. So you can ban guns, but if someone has these crazy ideas in their head, there will be deaths as a result. But no one has been as much a mass murderer of innocent men, women, and children as governments themselves. And that requires the principle, the long-run principle of people having the means of self-defending themselves, even against those in political authority in extreme circumstances of facing tyranny.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, that's the core rationale for the right to keep and bear arms, which our ancestors clearly understood. But you raise a point that I'd like to wrap up here with, and that's the notion of the type of society in which we're living. And this is one of the major distinguishing factors between us libertarians and non-libertarians. Because the dysfunctionality of this society, and I think there's massive dysfunctionality, it goes beyond these mass killings for no justifiable reason whatsoever. It's that you've got massive alcoholism all across America. You've got massive drug addiction, enough to justify the continuation of this 50-year-old long war on drugs. You've got ever-increasing suicide rates among military veterans as well as young people. They're just checking out of life. And so this reflects that there's a lot more going on here in society. My hunch is that it has to do with this denial of reality. And again, I'm no psychiatrist. I haven't received any training there. But I've read that if people deny reality, that it produces a psychosis. Well, you've got this massive denial of reality with respect to freedom. Now, libertarians are very mentally healthy in this area. We know we're not living in a free society. We recognize that. Our counterparts across America honestly believe they live in a free society. It's this life of the lie, this life of unreality, that we live in a society of massive mandatory charity that is supposed to make us good and caring and supposed to reflect our good and caring nature, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education grants, and all the other welfare state programs. There's no way you can reconcile a free society with mandatory charity. A voluntary society is a free society. You've got the drug war that jails people for ingesting substances. How is that possibly reconcilable with a free society? You've got a military regime that has the authority now to assassinate Americans, take them into military custody, put them into dungeons, torture them, all without due process of law and trial by jury. That's not reconcilable with a free society. You got a centrally managed, regulated society. You got a trade war with a trade dictator at the top, waging trade wars against other countries, unilaterally raising taxes, tariffs. You've got this brutal system of immigration controls and a police state along the border with highway checkpoints and warrantless searches of vehicles and ranches and farms. And through it all, Americans say, thank God I'm an American, because at least I know I'm free. And I think that life where you've seen Richard, those body cams where the cops are beating up a guy and they'll say stop resisting as they're beating him up on the ground. Well, I think that's what's happening in America. The screws are tightened ever tighter on the American people, destroying their freedom. And American officials are saying as they're tightening screws, thank me for your freedom, thank me for your freedom. And I think this is what is the root cause of a lot of this dysfunctionality and weird behavior, that people cannot come to grips with the fact of what we libertarians have discovered. This is not a free society. This is an unfree society, and if people want a free society, they need to join up with us libertarians.
I can't agree more. As I was saying, the restoration of a philosophy of individual freedom and the setting aside of a politics and economics, a sociology and a psychology of collectivism and tribalism will do much to bring harmony to the society by undermining this sick and perverse philosophy of them versus us, and the them are dehumanized. And if you dehumanize the them, the individual human being is lost in the mass, and then anything that is done to him is an act that has no humane sense to it, because you don't think of the other as a person like yourself.
All right, on that excellent note, we'll wrap it up, Richard. I enjoyed the conversation. It's not necessarily the brightest thing to be talking about, but unfortunately it's part of the society in which we live, and we share our libertarian perspectives as a way to resolve these kind of dysfunctional issues in our society. So I enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time, and I want to thank our viewers and listeners for sharing their time with us.
Yep, if you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation, come and visit us at fff.org. I write a daily blog. Richard contributes an article every month in our monthly journal. We also link to an article or reprint an article that he writes every week. So all with this idea of moving America in a more free, prosperous, peaceful, harmonious direction. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you all next week.